What roles did journalism play in shaping the food industry at the turn of the century? Yellow journalism is the use of sensationalism to increase newspaper sales and to form public opinion. This was often done through exaggerated headlines and biased stories. Sometimes, newspapers used misleading images in the form of drawings and political cartoons, which appealed to immigrants who read little or no English. Around the turn of the century, in their attempt to drive up circulation, some newspapers, such as Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Hearst's New York Journal, would sensationalize stories or even create news to the point where journalism was no longer purely objective. The height of yellow journalism came during the Spanish-American War. Both of the New York newspapers ran extensive, exaggerated front-page coverage of the war. If you're ever interested in seeing yellow journalism from that time in action, the Newseum in Washington, D.C. has an issue of the New York World focusing on the 1898 sinking of the USS Maine. The museum is not far from where the mast of the USS Maine sits at Arlington National Cemetery. Though one can see through this example how journalism connects to industrialism and even to immigrants, the question at hand is still about how journalism impacted the food industry. What grew out of the public's distaste for the negative journalism were the reform-oriented exposés and investigative journalists, often referred to as progressives or muckrakers. Investigative journalism is a practice in which reporters go deep to investigate a single topic of interest. These topics often involved crime, political corruption, or corporate wrongdoing. An investigative journalist may spend months or sometimes years researching and even going undercover to prepare a report, article, book, or exposé. The most prominent journalist to become known as the ultimate muckraker was Upton Sinclair because of his investigative journalism that led to his landmark 1906 book, The Jungle. In 1904, Upton Sinclair spent 7 weeks working undercover in Chicago's meatpacking plants. A year later, he wrote a series of articles for a socialist political newspaper called Appeal to Reason. These articles exposed unsanitary working conditions and how the meat industry was putting consumers at risk for disease. His original intentions were not so much about shining a light on the food industry as much as they were to look at the quote-unquote slave-like working conditions of immigrants and to give support to socialism in America. Unlike similar journalists of that time who turned their newspaper exposés into non-fiction books, Sinclair made the brilliant decision to publish his exposé in the form of a novel. Because readers had become sensitized and more experienced judging the exaggerated and fake stories written during the era of yellow journalism, perhaps Sinclair wanted his readers to ask if his accurate yet horrific descriptions of meat processing in his novel could be true. In a 1906 London Times literary review of The Jungle, the reviewer described Sinclair's impact on readers as if the social impact was more important than the literary aspect of the book. The book is published as a novel, and it might claim to be reviewed, therefore, under the head of fiction. But the very first thing that could be said about it is that, if it is a novel, a work of imagination and invention, the conduct of an author who invented and published in a form easily accessible to all readers, young and old, male or female, such disgusting, inflammatory matter as this would deserve the severest censure. Unhappily, we have good reason for believing it to be all fact, not fiction. the action of the president, remove all doubt, and give the book very great importance. By its truths or untruths, a story stands or falls, and it is with nothing less than horror that we learn it to be true. The review makes reference to the fact that President Teddy Roosevelt sent his own commission of investigators to Chicago in an effort to verify the very conditions that Sinclair exposed. Also significant in the review is the British newspaper's call to action, which, unfortunately, still holds true over 100 years later. The things described by Mr. Sinclair happened yesterday, are happening today, and will happen tomorrow and the next day, until some Hercules comes to cleanse the filthy stable. The President's commissioners had given instant validity to Sinclair's initial findings, and now newspapers around the country and abroad jumped on the bandwagon to uncover more dirt for their papers. Their goal was to feed the minds of inquiring readers with details that hit them close to home. Many newspapers tried to get investigative reporters inside slaughterhouses and packing facilities to get a new scoop on the story. To quote Upton Sinclair, "The lid was on in Packingtown, as companies caught on and hired guards and detectives to thwart the undercover efforts of journalists." Some in the food industry even took to newspapers directly to state their case and voice their disagreement with the findings of Roosevelt's commissioners. In mid-1906, the Franco-American Food Company in New Jersey purchased a large amount of space, the majority of a whole newspaper page, in the New York Times, to publish an quote-unquote open letter to President Roosevelt and the American nation. They described themselves as the quote-unquote packers of honestly and cleanly made products, and then made a plea to the president. "We regret that if you feel confident the report of your commissioners is true, you did not make the investigation more thorough. We consider the commissioner's statements incomplete. We appeal to your sense of justice and to that of the American people." By this time, however, the American public disregarded the open letter in the newspaper and did not buy into the attempt by the leaders of the food industry to persuade readers. Consumers across the nation, as well as merchants in many other countries who lost sales due to the scandal with bad meat from Chicago, supported strong food safety legislation. This, along with the findings of Roosevelt's investigative commission, no doubt gave strength to the president's decision to sign into law the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, as well as the Meat Inspection Act. Upton Sinclair's work resulted in consumers' awareness of some significant problems in the food industry. Ultimately, radical changes in the science, slaughter, processing, packaging, distribution, sales, and even the consumption of meat at the turn of the century are attributed to investigative journalism. More importantly, the Food and Drug Administration's modern regulatory functions began with the passage of the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, just as the U.S. Department of Agriculture's inspection functions gained significant strength with the passage of the 1906 Meat Inspection Act. Though they remained relatively untouched until a major upgrade in the 1990s, and even greater change with the Food Safety Modernization Act of 2011, these two laws empowered the federal government throughout the 20th century to keep a more vigilant eye over interstate commerce and protect consumers from adulterated and misbranded food and drugs. Journalism, as we can see, had a monumental impact on the economic and social aspects of food.